Hello, everyone. My name is Aisha Langford, and I'm the founder of Funeral Syllabus, where our motto is make a plan, keep the peace, leave a legacy. Today, I'll be talking with Timothy Schramm about advanced funeral planning. He is the owner slash CEO and funeral director for Hal Peterson Funeral Home and Cremation Services, which has 3 locations in Southeast Michigan. The goal of today's podcast is really to discuss some of the advantages and considerations for making funeral arrangements in advance. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump right into the questions. So, Mr. Schramm, can you tell us a little bit about your professional journey and what motivated you to become a funeral director?
Short, quick story. As a high school senior, got an athletic scholarship to Wayne State University. Going through the course catalog, which of course at that point in time was literally a paperback encyclopedia that you went through. I knew I didn't want to be a doctor, lawyer, teacher, and such, and I came across mortuary science. Looked at all of the 60 prerequisite hours, the 60 professional hours, and just thought, right, this would be interesting. It'd be something every class would be new and different. Um, the sciences, the social sciences, law, psychology, sociology, so on and so forth. But as a high school senior, I had taken a military aptitude test in which career choice number one was Marine Corps officer. Career choice number two was funeral director. And so that was stuck in the back of my head, and then I came across mortuary science, at Wayne State University and, did some research, talked with a couple of different of my high school teachers, counselors. I went down, spoke to Dr. Gordon Rose, who was the program director for the mortuary science program. He, showed me all around, talked about the classes. I was able to sit in on an embalming lab. He told me to go talk to 5 local funeral directors. 4 of them told me, "Don't do it. You'll hate your life. It's 24/7, 365 nights, weekends, holidays. You're going to miss family functions, family events." The 5th funeral director was Joe Peterson. And Joe spent 3 days with me as an 18-year-old high school senior, showed me every facet of funeral service. And at the end of those 3 days, he said to me, "When you start your last year of school, you give me a call, I'll give you a job." And when I started in my last year in the professional program at the Mortuary Science College, um, I called Mr. Peterson and I said, "I don't know if you remember me." He said, "Tall guy, football player, pinstripe suit, cowboy boots." I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "When do you want to start?" And that was 37 years.
Wow.
I worked here as a funeral service associate, working nights, weekends, holidays. Did my residency here. Just like an MD has to do a residency, a funeral director, part of their licensing process is a residency. Became a licensed funeral director, became a location manager, um, became vice president and director of operations. That was in '05. In 2011, there were 3 Peterson family members still, but none working in the business any longer. So they appointed me as the chief operating officer. And in 2015, began an ownership transition of taking over the funeral. So that's kind of a short, quick summary.
Right. Well, that's really interesting, and I'm glad he remembered you. So
Thank
if
you.
you yeah. So if you could just tell us who aren't, um, have never been introduced to the idea of advanced funeral planning. So what
Mhm.
is advanced funeral planning and how do people typically pay for it?
So 2 different pieces in that question. So you know, many people come in and um, they'll go through what we refer to as a pre-arrangement only. They'll get all of their wishes down on paper. So we'll secure vital statistics, types of ceremony, type of final disposition, type of merchandise selected so that the family at the very least has a guide from those. folks who have just put everything down on paper. The second part of your question is really the financing part, the pre-financing. Um, Realistically, it's really only about 25% of consumers actually pre-finance. And there's multiple ways to do that. One is through funeral homes have to, in the state of Michigan, funeral homes have to use a third party escrow agent. So that is set aside one, either through an insurance policy or two, through a trust. So there's two different options there. The option of the insurance policy is payment options, right? Payment terms. You can pay for that funeral, same as cash over 13 months. You can pay it for it over 3 years, over 5 years, over 7 years, over 10 years. The advantage is once you have completed any of those 3, 5, 7, 10-year plans, once you've completed 13 months of payments, and if something unexpected were to happen, um, the contract is guaranteed paid in full after those 13 months. That's the advantage of using, insurance. Now, not everybody's going to qualify for insurance based on health questions, um, and so then we have a trust option, and so just like you would set aside finances, your personal finances potentially in a trust for your family, it's the same type thing. We use master escrow plan through the Michigan Funeral Directors Association. Um, and again, there's guaranteed contracts and non-guaranteed contracts. So there's options that way. The last way is what's called a non-associated funeral insurance trust. And so let's say you have an insurance policy through ABC Life Insurance Company that is assignable to a funeral home at the time of your death. We can do that assignment ahead of time. So you still own the policy, but ultimately, upon your death, the funeral home becomes the beneficiary of that policy for performing their services and providing any type of merchandise that was included in that.
Okay. And for people who may want to consider advanced funeral planning, what would you say are some of the benefits of doing this in advance?
The first benefit, again, whether you prearrange only or decide to pre-finance, the first benefit is it does help to ease the emotional burden that's left upon the family. Let's face it, most people don't talk about their own mortality. People don't talk with their, again, it's a generality, but generally speaking, people don't talk with their family members. Well, I want to have 1 day visitation with a funeral mass at Sacred Heart Catholic Church, and I want to be buried at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. Just not conversations that people, usually have. Um, so by having that prearrangement on file, right, that just kind of provides a little bit of ease of the emotional burden. What do we do now, right? Dad came in, completed some advanced funeral planning. Here's everything he wanted to do. Here's the merchandise that he selected. Just it makes it easier for the family. The pre-financing piece, again, eases the emotional and financial burden that's left upon the family because how are we going to pay for this? Most funeral homes, they're, as we refer to it, our choices related to payment policy. The payment, the account has to be secured, generally speaking, before services are rendered or at least at the completion of services being rendered. And with that pre-finance, right, you don't have to worry about that payment. You don't have to worry about, well, we've got to move funds from this account or that account. Dad had a life insurance policy, um, but, you know, what people don't realize is most insurance policies take 6, 8 to 12 weeks to pay out to the beneficiary. Now,
Okay.
there are insurance policies that are assignable to the funeral home. So let's say you have a $25,000 life insurance policy and your funeral expenses are $10,000, there are insurance companies that will do an assignment of that $10,000 payable directly to the funeral home. And we happen to work with a company that can make that happen in 24 to 48 hours. But even in that 24, 48 hours, right, families are waiting on pins and needles, right? Because what happens like this past week, right? A death occurs on Wednesday. Well, the insurance companies are not open Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So now we can't make contact with them until today. So now the family has been waiting 5 days now for an answer on, is this policy valid? Is it assignable? Is there enough to pay for those funeral expenses? And so they're still waiting. And unfortunately, that's a real world example of a family that we're serving today. Um, so again, when you talk about the emotional and financial burden that's left upon the family, when you go in for a funeral planning conference, the family is literally answering 165 questions. Now, as a funeral service professional, it's certainly our goal to make it a conversation and not make it feel like I'm asking you, question 101, 102, 103, right? We're just having a conversation, but there's literally 165 questions that we're going to ask that the family may not know the answer or not know how to answer or not sure what dad wanted, what mom wanted, what my aunt wanted, what my uncle wanted, right? Those types of things. And, so that's the emotional burden. And then the financial burden, let's face it, consumer prices are increasing in everything. And funeral service is no different, right? Our operating expenses, just like for you at home, your operating expense of your utilities, heating, cooling, electrical, water, all of those prices have gone up, just like ours have gone up. The price of wages, salaries, benefits have all increased. Um, the cost of goods sold, whether it's a burial casket, cremation casket, alternative container, outer burial container, urn, cemetery marker, memorial stationery, whatever it is, all of those things are increased price. So the real value and benefit of pre-arranging and pre-financing is you lock in today's cost with the funeral home for their services and merchandise they're going to provide. Now, we can't lock in other people's costs, newspapers, cemeteries, churches, clergy, those types of things, but we can have funds that are set aside for those expenses. And that is ultimately the value and benefit of advanced funeral planning is your family, all they have to do is make a phone call and everything is taken care of from there.
Okay. And how people don't like thinking about death for themselves or their loved ones. So, in general, how far in advance might one consider planning a funeral? For example, is there a general age range that funeral directors suggest thinking about it, or a life circumstance where people might consider planning their funeral far in advance?
Yeah, great question, and there's no real one answer to that question, right? When you look at our buyers of those people who are completing their advanced funeral planning, quite honestly, that's anywhere between 45 and 75 years old. Right? So that's a pretty big age range. The question really is what makes people, take that step? And
Mhm.
so it's generally a life event, right? Somebody has died, right? That's people start thinking about their own mortality in that point in time. Um, uh, you have an experience where um, someone you love has passed away. They have not completed any advanced funeral planning. They haven't completed any estate planning. They don't have a will. They don't have a trust. They don't have beneficiaries on their bank accounts. They don't have beneficiaries named on life insurance. That's a process that can drag somebody out 12, 16, 18 months, right? Before there's resolution to that entire process. So that will make people think, okay, right, I don't want to leave my kids in this situation. I don't want to leave my family in this situation. They get their will done, their trust done, they go and they complete their advanced planning. That's a life event that happens that makes people think about it. A spouse dies, right? Husband and wife, been married 55, 65 years, never completed their advanced funeral planning. Husband passes away, right? Mom, right? She doesn't want her kids to have to go through what she just went through. And so now she completes her advanced funeral planning. Um, so really life event. Somebody goes into a nursing home. Somebody uh, experiences a potential terminal medical diagnosis, those types of things will lead people into um, people completing their estate planning, right? A really good estate planning attorney is going to recommend to their client that they need to go to their funeral home of choice and complete their advanced funeral plan. So
Okay.
those are really, kind of there's a life event or somebody is really trying to take care of all of their estate planning are really the two reasons why people come in and complete that.
Okay. And with advanced funeral planning, and you just mentioned it a little bit, do people typically pick a specific funeral home in their local area where they want to be buried or cremated?
Yeah, because otherwise, realistically, right? So you see people will you see commercials as an example for final expense insurance or funeral expense insurance, um, which is both great, but is it assignable? And then is the funeral home that you're going to choose for your loved one, will they work with insurance companies through that assignment and so on? So that's the challenge too. If you're really going to complete your advanced funeral planning, you've got to walk through the funeral home doors and sit down and speak with a licensed funeral service professional in order to do that. Because
Okay.
in the end, it's a mortuary science licensee, that licensed funeral service professional that's going to be required to care and supervise the final disposition of that person.
Okay. Now, let's say someone is 50 years old and they say, next week, I'm going to do my advanced funeral planning with X funeral home in my local area. And we're in Michigan right now. So we're going to say
Mhm,
down the street in Michigan, I've picked my funeral home. And in 10 years, they win the lottery and they move out to Hollywood.
mhm.
So, what happens if you've made arrangements in your local area, but for whatever reason you move out of state or maybe you change your mind? Can you get a
Mhm.
refund or are you just out of luck? What typically happens?
So I'm going to answer that. There's two answers to that question. So the first answer is there's different state laws in every state. So I can't blanket answer that question, right? There are states where the laws are quite different than what they are in Michigan. Michigan's laws are focused on consumer protection as they should be. So in the state of Michigan, those funds are always yours, are always fully transferable, even up to the time of death, right? So even if, like you said, you won the lottery and you moved to Hawaii, right? Even at the time of death in Hawaii, those funds can be transferred from the funeral home in Michigan to the funeral home in Hawaii. And
Okay.
again, with the insurance product, you don't even have to go through the funeral home in Michigan. You can go right through that insurance company. That funeral home in Hawaii can go right through that insurance company to capture that benefit that has been paid. Um, the second thing in the state of Michigan, not only is it always yours, it is always 100% refundable,
Okay.
right? So if you decide to cancel, if you decide to move, if you decide to transfer, even at the time of death, if your family decides, well, we're going to do things a little different, right? Those funds are always yours here in the state of Michigan, and they never go away from you, regardless of whether you move, you change your mind, or even if the funeral home goes out of business, right?
Okay.
Those funds are still always yours. And again, the state of Michigan is very consumer protection oriented, as they should be. Um, and so it's a great benefit for residents in the state of Michigan.
Okay. And so the take home message is that wherever people are, whether they're listening to this in New York or Illinois or Georgia, just to be aware of what your state laws say and what protections are available there. And where would someone find that kind of information?
My first recommendation would be stop in and talk to your local funeral director
Okay.
wherever you're living now, right? There's going to be a funeral home around you somewhere. Um, again, you're out in a rural area, might you have to drive 20 or 30 minutes? Call the funeral home, set an appointment, go in and ask questions, right? They're going to be your greatest resource. Two, State Funeral Directors Association,
Okay.
right? So, as in the state of Michigan, the Michigan Funeral Directors Association, any state funeral director association will be able to answer those questions for you.
Okay.
And every state in the union has a FD association. Um, so they can answer those questions for you also.
Okay, great. And speaking of funeral homes, so what might you say to people who may be concerned that the funeral home that they pick or want to work with may go out of business if they plan too far in advance?
So one, again, I'll speak personally, right? So Hal Peterson, we've been here now. We are just finishing our 151st year.
Wow.
So
Okay.
there were two generations of the Howe family. There were three generations of the Peterson family, which I happen to work for all three generations of the Peterson family. And then I own it now. And again, my vision is to continue to maintain employee owned and operated so that we will continue, right? We're going to continue on. Now, it's not to say that, funeral homes don't go out of business. I've been, in business long enough that I've seen. And so again, in the state of Michigan, and I can't answer for every state, but in the state of Michigan, if Howe Peterson Funeral Home were to close, right, I have to find another licensed funeral home that will take on our book of business of those advanced funeral plans,
Okay.
right? So that is a legal responsibility of mine. And then again, too, right, you as the consumer will be notified that your prearrangement has been moved from ABC Funeral Home to Hal Peterson Funeral Home. It's still your choice, right? Well, we know Hal Peterson, um, but it's not where we want to go. And so you can transfer your funds to wherever you do want to go, even though
Okay.
your funeral home is closed. Again, in the state of Michigan, consumer protection, right? Those funds are always the consumers. So regardless of what happens to the funeral home, always yours.
Okay. And then my last question is we're both based in the state of Michigan, but hopefully people will be listening or watching this podcast from around the United States. So, what are your tips for helping people pick a funeral home that is trustworthy wherever they are?
So the first thing I would say is, you know, drive by a building. Does it look like it's kept up, that it's well maintained, that it's being taken care of? To go in, have a conversation. Who are these people that are inside of this building, right? Do you create a connection? Do you develop a personal relationship? Um, are you a member of a local church in the community? Who would they recommend? Who do they like to work with? Um, you know, are you a member of a social or fraternal organization, right? Who would they recommend? And then, of course, in today's world, what do most people do? Right? They Google it.
Right.
So, I mean, Google reviews are there, right? And my wife, and again, I'm not real good at doing it, but that's just my personal choice. But my wife will look at Google reviews. It doesn't matter if she's buying steak knives or a vacuum cleaner, right? She's going to look at what are the reviews. And again, nobody's going to be perfect. But when you see one funeral home that has, let's say 4.7 stars on 75 Google reviews, and the other funeral home has 4.8 stars on 3 Google reviews, right? That's telling you something,
Right.
right? And so um, it may not be where I would go, but you certainly can do that. But I would encourage people go into the funeral home, have a conversation with a licensed funeral service professional, and get to know them as a person. What do they value? How do they do things? What do they believe in? And make your choice from there.